Hello, and welcome back to Checkmate, Atun-Shei, the series where I've ran out of alliterations to annul the agonizing pain after watching this entire series from Atun-Shei films. Today, we have finally come to the end of my prolonged prostration. This episode will be covering the final episode of Checkmate Lincolnites, titled The Cornerstone of Johnny Reb. This episode has been a long time coming, especially considering that this episode was apparently delayed from its original May release, all the way into June. This was an episode I was anticipating to see, as there was speculation between me and my Twitter colleagues over what this episode would be about. Considering everything I have gone through, and the insanity this series has produced, I was expecting something that would go far off into the left field. However, what I got instead was rather disappointing, to say the least. Rather than getting something completely unhinged and crazy, something to the effect of comparing the Confederacy to fascism, for instance, instead we got something that played it safe. What was the final episode about? The episode that everyone has been waiting to relentlessly tear apart or post to the four corners of the internet as an unironic source for their beliefs. It was about the secession documents. Yes, that's what this heavily overhyped final episode of one of the longest running trash fires in Civil War discussion would end on. A topic so thoroughly picked to pieces that there might not be much of any value to talk about. However, for the sake of completing the series, and to provide some counter-arguments to what is presented, I will cover this episode as I've done with the others. So, with all that out of the way, let us begin. We start off the episode with, well, this.
You know, Johnny, I'm not going to do this if you're not going to listen.
I'll listen, Billy. I will. It's not easy for me.
Do you mean that, though? Or are you just saying it?
My mind is open. Convince me if you can.
All right.
When I saw this opening, I thought to myself, why would anyone want to talk to you after everything you've done? Especially when we consider how he acted near the end of the previous episode, effectively insulting Johnny Reb and, in turn, the audience that doesn't agree with his statements like the garbage he believes they are. If I were in the position Johnny Reb was in, I would simply not engage with the argument at that point. Then again, if I were Johnny Reb, I'd have been dead for over half a decade, since he brutally murdered his straw man in the very first episode of this series. It has been firmly established that Atun-Shei cannot have a proper argument without strawmanning the opposition in order to make them say what he wants them to say, not what they actually said. But Boots, some might say, he has taken these talking points from comments. That means it isn't a straw man. The issue with that argument is quite simple. Just because they are based on a comment does not mean the comments chosen are a good representation of the argument being presented, nor does it equate to a genuine response. As I pointed out all the way back in episode 1 of this series, you can take comments out of context in order to make people say what you want them to say. A straw man is made by taking legitimate statements out of the context they were in to then produce a caricature of the person in question. This is why it's considered a fallacy. It deprives the person of their say as a means of controlling the argument. This is the most prevalent fallacy committed by Atun-Shei, exhibited right from the very beginning with the conceptualization of the Johnny Reb caricature at the inception of the series. Johnny Reb was, is, and will always be a straw man. If he were a true character, this entire situation would be a form of Stockholm Syndrome. Johnny Rep feels compelled to have the discussion and has come to like Atun-Shei, even though Atun-Shei has treated him like garbage. Atun-Shei is the abusive husband, while Johnny Reb, either out of genuine fear or a misguided sense of, I can change him, is the wife with the swollen black eye. This point might seem irrelevant, but it is worth mentioning if only to remind us all of what we are dealing with. From here, we finally get to the grand reveal of what this entire travesty is going to be about, much to my own disappointment.
We've talked about a lot of Southern history on this show, from 1776 to the modern day. But there's one thing we've never actually touched on: the Confederacy's founding documents. What the governments and politicians of Southern states themselves said, loudly and publicly, in 1860 and 61, justifying their secession.
The secession documents. Really? That's your big last move? I ain't no spring chicken, Billy, and this ain't Civil War History 101.
Trust me, I don't think you know just how deep this goes and how crazy it gets.
Well, this is the low-hanging fruit to end all low-hanging fruit. While I was waiting for this episode to come out, my friend on Twitter, Blue and Butternut, and I had engaged in some guesswork about what this episode would be about. He had a various range of suggestions of what this entire thing would be discussing. But, as for me, I'd suspected it would be something more unhinged. Preferably a heavy-handed comparison between Nazism and the Confederacy. From my perspective, that would have been an entertaining topic to meticulously go over, and was technically hinted at throughout the series. To my absolute disappointment, Atun-Shei decided to pick the tried and not-so-true talking point of referring to the secession documents. My reasoning for being disappointed is quite simple. The appeal to the secession documents inevitably and invariably comes down to cherry-picking the same overused quotes over and over again while disregarding the rest of these, quite often, doctorate-length documents with exceeding levels of detail over what, exactly, led to their secession. The problem, of course, is most people don't care to read what these documents say in their totality, oft quoting the memeable mentions of slavery, while ignoring the inconvenient details that provide context as to why they might make those remarks, and or ignoring the details that show there were other motivations for secession, many of which are only tentatively related to the slavery debate. From here, he will be going over each state and, supposedly, their secession documents. I will also be covering the secession documents myself, if the state has a secession document, and best explain what the complaints of each state were. Atun-Shei begins with South Carolina.
Okay, so here's what happened. On December 24th, 1860, the South Carolina Secession Convention drafts a Declaration of Immediate Causes of Separation, wherein they state,
"The non-slaveholding states have assumed the right of deciding upon the propriety of our domestic institutions. They have denounced as sinful the institution of slavery. They have permitted the open establishment among them of abolitionist societies, whose avowed object is to take away the property of the civilians of other states. They have encouraged and assisted thousands of our slaves to leave their homes, and those who remain have been incited to servile insurrection."
The declaration of the immediate causes which induce and justify the secession of South Carolina from the Federal Union is not simply summarized by that statement. In fact, the quote Atun-Shei uses is one that, much as with many of the quotations he has used, is heavily altered from the original statement. The full paragraph in question is as follows. "We affirm that these ends for which this government was instituted have been defeated, and the government itself has been made destructive of them by the actions of the non-slaveholding states. Those states have assumed the right of deciding upon the propriety of our domestic institutions, and have denied the right of property established in 15 of the states and recognized by the Constitution. They have denounced as sinful the institution of slavery. They have permitted open establishment among them of societies whose avowed object is to disturb the peace and to elloign the property of the citizens of other states. They have encouraged and assisted thousands of our slaves to leave their homes, and those who remain have been incited by emissaries, books, and pictures to servile insurrection. This statement comes about near the end of the document, making up only 5% of the total document's length. The document in question is approximately 2,000 words in length and has two centralizing foci: an explanation for the legality of secession and the reasons for why they were seceding. The first section of the document outlines the formation of the United States, emphasizing throughout it the sovereignty of the states. It asserts that the Constitution was drafted with this concept in mind through the following statement. By this Constitution, certain duties were imposed upon the several states, and the exercise of certain of their powers was restrained, which necessarily implied their continued existence as sovereign states. But to remove all doubt, an amendment was added, which declared that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. On the 23rd of May, 1788, South Carolina, by convention of her people, passed an ordinance assenting to this Constitution, and afterwards altered her own Constitution to conform herself to the obligations she had undertaken. Through this, they make the following conclusion. We hold that the government thus established is subject to the two great principles asserted in the Declaration of Independence, and we hold further that the mode for its formation subjects it to a third fundamental principle, namely, the law of compact. We maintain that in every compact between two or more parties, the obligation is mutual, that the failure of one of the contracting parties to perform a material part of the agreement entirely releases the obligation of the other, and that where no arbiter is provided, each party is remitted to his own judgment to determine the fact of failure, with all its consequences. The reason for this assertion is as a means to justify the legality of secession. As we covered back in episode 8, James Madison had asserted that the Constitution was a compact that all parties were obligated to follow. It is through the violation of this compact that Madison argues secession can be justified as a legal option. Otherwise, secession could not be considered a legal course of action. It is from here that the document outlines the violations in question. Namely, they point towards the violations of Article 4, Sections 2 and 3 of the Constitution by the Northern states. Article 4, Section 3, known as the Fugitives of Labor Clause, entails that all states are obligated to return any fugitives of labor back to the states they had fled from. This referred specifically to slaves who ran away from their service charged. Section 2 of the same article is the Extradition Clause, the clause in the Constitution mandating that a state return any fugitives of the law to the state they broke the law within in order to face trial and punishment for their crime. In the document, South Carolina outlines where specifically these two clauses were violated. But an increasing hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery has led to a disregard of the obligations, and the laws of the general government have ceased to affect the object of the Constitution. The states of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa have enacted laws which either nullify the acts of Congress or render useless any attempt to execute them. In many of these states, the fugitive is discharged from service or labor claimed, and in none of them has the state government complied with the stipulation made in the Constitution. The state of New Jersey, at an early day, passed a law in conformity with her constitutional obligation, but the current of anti-slavery feeling has led her more recently to enact laws which render inoperative the remedies provided by her own law and by the laws of Congress. In the state of New York, even the right of transit for a slave has been denied by her tribunals, and the states of Ohio and Iowa have refused to surrender to justice fugitives charged with murder, and with inciting servile insurrection in the state of Virginia. Thus, the Constituted Compact has been deliberately broken and disregarded by the non-slaveholding states, and the consequence follows that South Carolina is released from her obligation. It was not merely that slavery was under attack that drove South Carolina to secede. It was due to the overt violation of the Constitution in the North's endeavor to abolish the institution that South Carolina saw a direct attack against them and the very notion of the sovereignty of the states. In fact, near the end of the document, stated in its own paragraph, is the following statement. The guarantees of the Constitution will then no longer exist. The equal rights of the states will be lost. The slaveholding states will no longer have the power of self-government or self-protection, and the federal government will have become their enemy. Much of the document discusses slavery within this, and does note the notion of the North's hostility towards the institution. Yet, that is only one aspect of the problem. The South's great underlying fear is the outright subversion, its submersion, as the document describes it, of the Constitution by the sectional political bloc of the northern states, and the destruction of the very idea of the sovereignty of the states. Slavery in all of this is instigating this debate. It was not merely the notion that slavery was under attack. Rather, it was the overt transgression of the Constitution as a compact between the states and the North's endeavor to abolish the institution of slavery that caused the conflict. Simply put, slavery was relevant because the North was using it to impose upon the South what they wanted. Secession was prompted not simply due to slavery being under attack, but due to the North undermining the entire political system in order to get what they wanted, the abolition of the institution. It was the undermining of the Constitution and the sovereignty of the states that South Carolina objected to as much, if not more so, than the notion of the abolition of slavery. From here, we move on to Mississippi.
Mississippi seceded on January 9th, 1861, and about 2 weeks later, their secession convention drafted its own declaration.
Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. Utter subjugation awaits us in the Union if we should consent longer to remain in it. It is not a matter of choice, but of necessity. We must either submit to degradation and to the loss of property worth $4 billion of money, or we must secede from the Union framed by our fathers.
In a declaration of the immediate causes which induce and justify the secession of the state of Mississippi from the federal union, they lay down the various issues they have in a listed format, making it a markedly short document when compared to South Carolina's document. Many of these issues are identified with the institution of slavery, as Atun-Shei claims, but it's a bit more complex than he lets it on to be. First, we should note that the quotation here, as with the quotation from the South Carolina secession document, is another one of those doctored quotes. He takes the first part of the first sentence of the second paragraph and cobbles it together with the rest of the last paragraph, skipping over the reasons they stated for why they seceded and, of greater importance, the ramifications of abolition without considering the consequences of it. Namely, they make note that the products produced in the South are heavily relied upon by the rest of the world, not just the South. Second, we should know that a number of the reasons for their secession overlap with those of South Carolina. Specifically, they state, it tramples the original equality of the South underfoot, and it has nullified the fugitive slave law in almost every free state in the Union, and has utterly broken the compact which our fathers pledged their faith to maintain. These 2 points link back to the issue of the hostility of the northern states and their willingness to throw the political system under the bus to get what they wanted. In addition, they make another note that is seldom discussed. They state, it seeks not to elevate or to support the slave, but to destroy his present condition without providing a better. This particular point is intriguing as it suggests that these states may have been open to the idea of abolition. Their issue, however, partially stems from the Northern abolitionists' lack of a coherent plan to deal with the enslaved population upon their freedom. This characterizes the abolitionists as acting brashly, acting without any plan beyond the short-term goal of ending the institution. From here, we move on to Florida.
Florida seceded just a day after Mississippi, declaring that
all hope of the preservation of the federal union, upon terms consistent with the safety and honor of the slaveholding states, has finally dissipated by the recent indications of the strength of the anti-slavery sentiment in the free states.
First, I'd want to note here that Florida never officially published their causes for secession. A rough draft of their causes was found well over a century after the war, which Atun-Shei apparently is citing this quote from. So, let's take a look and see if this quotation is in the docu, and it's not even in here. Initially, I was stumped at where he got this quote from. So I asked my friend, Blue and Butternut, for some help. He directed me towards the Journal of the Proceedings of the Convention of the People of Florida, which is a record of what transpired during the secession convention in Florida during January of 1861. After doing some digging, I found exactly where this was said. This was not featured in the causes of secession, but a preamble to the Florida Convention. The preamble in question was proposed by convention member McQueen McIntosh on the second day of the convention, Saturday, January 5th, 1861. The full motion read, "Whereas all hope of the preservation of the federal union upon terms consistent with the safety and honor of the slaveholding states have been finally dissipated by the recent indications of the strength of the anti-slavery sentiment of the free states, therefore, be it resolved by the people of the state of Florida in convention assembled that as it is the undoubted right of the several states of the federal union known as the United States of America to withdraw from said union at such time and for such cause or causes as in the opinion of the people of each state acting in their sovereign capacity may be just and proper, in the opinion of this convention, the existing causes as such as to compel the state of Florida to proceed to exercise that right." This motion had been laid on the table for the day and was revisited on Monday, January 7th, 1861, by George Taliaferro Ward. Ward, who is not an ardent secessionist, would bring the resolution once more to the table. This would pass, though not without moving the previous question to shut off any amendments to the preamble and resolution in question. This motion was not a part of the Declaration of Causes, but was a statement of what the convention was meeting for, the legality of secession, and the reasons for secession. This is not mentioned once within the unreleased causes of secession. In fact, as it turns out, the reason for this discrepancy comes down to Atun-Shei not providing the full name and exact date of publication of the resolution. In the book he used for this section, The Confederate and Neo-Confederate Reader, The Great Truth About the Lost Cause, by James W. Lowen and Edwin H. Sebesta, it provides a more detailed version of the name, including the exact date of passage. This is a novice mistake, and an unacceptable one, given how much time he had to produce this video. Now, if we analyze the unreleased Florida causes of secession, we end up finding many of the same things mentioned in South Carolina's secession document. Namely, the third and fourth paragraph state, "Laws clearly constitutional and as decided to be by the federal judiciary, as well as by the courts of all the non-slaveholding states where the question has been presented for adjudication, have been by counter legislation rendered inoperative. Laws without the power to pass which none will deny that the Constitution would not have been adopted. The nullification of these laws by the legislatures of 2/3 of the non-slaveholding states, important as it is in itself, is additionally as is furnishing evidence of an open disregard of the constitutional obligation and of the rights and interests of the slaveholding states, and of a deep and inveterable hostility to the people of these states." You might be noticing a pattern here. the secession documents discuss slavery, but more often than not, they discuss it through the purview of the northern states breaking constitutional law in order to get their way on this issue. In their eyes, what is egregious is not merely that slavery is under attack, but the North is willingly and openly violating the compact they agreed to for motives the South views as intrinsically selfish and hostile towards the interests of those not within that particular power bloc. This pattern will only continue. Next, Atun-Shei discusses Alabama.
Alabama, following suit on January 11th.
A sectional party known as the Black Republican Party,
And they mean black in a racial sense.
has in the recent election elected Abraham Lincoln to the office of president upon the avowed principle that the Constitution of the United States does not recognize property in slaves, and that the government should prevent its extension into the common territories of the United States, and that the power of the government should be so exercised that slavery, in time, should be exterminated.
This comes from a resolution of resistance that was declared by the Alabama Secession Convention on January 7, 1861. The statement, for once, includes most of the original text from the paragraph it is citing from, only leaving out, and Hannibal Hamlin to the office of Vice President of these United States, from the document. However, what is important to note is that this resolution of resistance is a multi-paragraph document, specifically 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph states, whereas the only bond of union between the several states in the Constitution of the United States, and whereas that Constitution has been violated both by the government of the United States and by a majority of the northern states, and their separate legislative action, denying to the people of the southern states their constitutional rights. From here, the paragraph Atun-Shei cited adds additional detail as to explain what exactly was being violated and how it was being violated. It then reaches the following conclusion. Therefore, be it resolved by the people of Alabama in solemn convention assembled that these acts and designs constitute such a violation of the compact between the several states as absolves the people of Alabama from all obligations to continue to support a government of the United States, to be administered upon such principles, and that the principles of Alabama will not submit to be parties to the inauguration and administration of Abraham Lincoln as President and Hannibal Hamlin as Vice President of the United States of America. This, once again, alludes to the same issues South Carolina, Mississippi, and Florida outlined. This view was one that they consistently held, even prior to the election of 1860. On February 24, 1860, the Alabama legislature convened and passed a joint resolution, expressing their fears of what exactly the North would do. The preamble to this resolution states, whereas anti-slavery agitation persistently continued in the non-slaveholding states of this Union for more than a third of a century, marked at every stage of its progress by contempt for the obligations of law and the sanctity of compacts, evincing a deadly hostility to the rights and institutions of the Southern people, and a settled purpose to effect their overthrow even by the subversion of the Constitution, and at the hazard of violence and bloodshed. And whereas a section party calling itself Republican, committed alike by its own acts of antecedents and the public avowals and secret machinations of its leaders to the execution of these atrocious designs, has acquired the ascendancy in nearly every northern state, and hopes by success in the approaching presidential election to seize the government itself. And whereas to permit such a seizure by those whose unmistakable aim is to pervert its whole machinery to the destruction of a portion of its members would be an act of suicidal folly and madness, almost without a parallel in history. And whereas the General Assembly of Alabama, representing a people loyally devoted to the Union of the Constitution, but scorning the Union which fanaticism would erect upon its ruins, deem it their solemn duty to provide and advance the means by which they may escape such peril and dishonor, and devise new securities for perpetuating the blessings of liberty to themselves and their posterity. Their concerns return to the same problem: the hostility of the northern states and their willingness to throw out the entire political system just to get what they wanted. An act that the Alabama delegation and the people of that state viewed as overtly hostile to the principles on which the country was founded upon. From here, we move on to the Georgia secession document.
Georgia's report on the causes of secession, drafted on January 29th, harps on a similar theme.
This is the party to whom the people of the North have committed the government, the prohibition of slavery in the territories, hostility to it everywhere, the equality of the black and white races, disregard of all constitutional guarantees in its favor, were boldly proclaimed by its leaders and applauded by its followers.
Firstly, this is taken from a few lines in the middle of the document and is largely stripped of its original context. The full section states the following. The presidential election of 1852 resulted in the total overthrow of the advocates of restriction and their party friends. Immediately after this result, the anti-slavery portion of the defeated party resolved to unite all the elements in the North opposed to slavery and to stake their future political fortunes upon their hostility to slavery everywhere. This is the party to whom the people of the North have committed the government. They raised their standard in 1856 and were barely defeated. They entered the presidential contest again in 1860 and succeeded. The prohibition of slavery in the territories, hostility to it everywhere, the equality of the black and white races, disregard of all constitutional guarantees in its favor, were boldly proclaimed by its leaders and applauded by its followers. With these principles on their banners and these utterances in their lips, the majority of the people of the North demanded that we shall receive them as our rulers. What is being stated here is an observation. This isn't a declaration for why they were seceding, but a statement of the values that their opponents allegedly held. However, what this is alluding to is that the values in question weren't legitimate values whatsoever. Rather, the secession document, a considerable document that is over 3,300 words long, is alluding to these values as being false, a means for the Northern sectional party to exercise power over the Southern states. The opening paragraph, which sits at nearly 1,000 words in length, goes into detail about the foundation of the Republican Party and the current situation. One matter that is discussed heavily in this paragraph is the matter of the federal expenditure to subsidize the numerous industries in the North. The document goes on to say the following. But when these reasons ceased, they were no less clamorous for government protection, but their clamors were less heeded. The country had put the principal protection on trial and condemned it. After having enjoyed protection to the extent of from 15 to 200% upon their entire business for above 30 years, the Act of 1846 was passed. It avoided sudden change, but the principle was settled, and free trade, low duties, and economy in public expenditures was the verdict of the American people. The South and the Northwestern states sustained this policy. There was but small hope of its reversal. Upon the direct issue, none at all. All these classes saw this and felt it and cast about for new allies. The anti-slavery sentiment of the North offered the best chance for success. An anti-slavery party must necessarily look to the North alone for support, but a united North was now strong enough to control the government in all of its departments, and a sectional party was therefore determined upon. Time and issue upon slavery were necessary to its completion and final triumph. From the view of the Georgia delegation, the reason why the North hopped on the anti-slavery bandwagon was due to their desire to exercise political power over the federal body, utilizing the slavery debate as a means to satisfy their self-interest. As with the previous examples, they too would list many of the same reasons concerning constitutional violations, chiefly the violation of the Fugitives of Labor Clause and the Extradition Clause of the Constitution. These two particular violations are further upheld by the preamble to the Constitution, which outlines that protecting the peace is one of the main goals of the document. The Georgia secession document provides the following conclusion. Such are the opinions and such are the practices of the Republican Party, who have been called by their own voters to administer the federal government under the Constitution of the United States. We know their treachery. We know the shallow pretenses under which they daily disregard its plainest obligations. If we submit to them, it will be our fault and not theirs. The people of Georgia have ever been willing to stand by this bargain, this contract. They have never sought to evade any of its obligations. They have never hitherto sought to establish any new government. They have struggled to maintain the ancient right of themselves and the human race through and by that Constitution. But they know the value of parchment rights in treacherous hands, and therefore they refuse to commit their own to the rulers whom the North offers. Why? Because by their declared principles and policy they have outlawed $3 billion of our property in the common territories of the Union, put it under the ban of the Republic in the states where it exists and out of the protection of federal law everywhere. Because they give sanctuary to thieves and incendiaries who assail it to the whole extent of their power, in spite of their most solemn obligations and covenants. Because their avowed principle is to subvert our society and subject us not only to the loss of our property, but the destruction of ourselves, our wives, and our children, and the desolation of our homes, our altars, and our firesides. To avoid these evils, we resume the powers which our fathers delegated to the government of the United States, and henceforth will seek new safeguards for our liberty, equality, security, and tranquility. Some of the complaints addressed in this secession document, such as their issue with protectionist tariffs, would be directly addressed within the Confederate Constitution. Slavery in all of this is only a component to the problems the South had. From here, we move on to Louisiana.
Louisiana didn't draft a declaration when they seceded on January 26th, but the state government, fearful that they might have to fight Texas in the Civil War sure to follow, sent a diplomat named George Williamson to the Lone Star State to extensively lay out their reasons for secession and urge Texans to join them in rebellion.
The people of Louisiana would consider it a most fatal blow to African slavery if Texas should not join her destinies to theirs in a Southern Confederacy. If she remains in the Union, the abolitionists would continue their work of incendiarism and murder. Immigrant aid societies would arm with sharps rifles predatory bands to infest her northern borders.
First, let's take a look at the statement Atun-Shei cited here. George Williamson, the commissioner for the state of Louisiana, gave a speech to the Texas Secession Convention regarding the need for Texas to join her neighbors. The statement Atun-Shei provided seems damning, but there's a catch. There's far more to the singular statement than what Atun-Shei provided, and it isn't just strictly reserved to the question of slavery. George Williamson would say the following. The people of Louisiana would consider it a most fatal blow to African slavery if Texas either did not secede or, having seceded, should not join her destinies to theirs in a Southern Confederacy. If she remains in the Union, the abolitionists would continue their work of incendiarism and murder. Immigrant aid societies would arm with sharps rifles predatory bands to infest her northern borders. The federal government would market her calamity in accepting the recent bribes in the Army Bill and Pacific Railroad Bill, and with abolition treachery would leave her unprotected frontier to the murderous inroads of hostile savages. Experience justifies these expectations. A professedly friendly federal administration gave Texas no substantial protection against the Indians or abolitionists. And what must she look for from an administration avowedly amicable and supported by no vote within her borders? Promises won from the timid and faithless are poor hostages of good faith. Even so, this doesn't relate to us what prompted Louisiana's secession. These are statements that were made to try to appeal to Texans to secede from the Union. Instead, George Williamson gave the following explanation for why Louisiana seceded. The people of Louisiana were unwilling to endanger their liberties and property by submission to the despotism of a single tyrant, or the canton tyranny of Pharisaical majorities. Insulted by the denial of her constitutional equality by the non-slaveholding states, outraged by their contemptuous rejection of proffered compromises, and convinced that she was illustrating the capacity of her people for self-government by withdrawing from a union that had failed, without fault of hers, to accomplish its purposes, she declared herself a free and independent state on the 26th day of January last. This is further enumerated in one resolution of the Louisiana State Convention, and a considerable ordinance presented by Mr. Rozier on January 24, 1861, he stated the following. Whereas many of the non-slaveholding states have passed laws with the design and with the effect of embarrassing and preventing the operation of that clause of the Constitution and of the laws of Congress passed in accordance therewith in regard to the reclaiming of fugitive slaves, thus trampling on one of the clear and valued rights secured to the South by the Constitution and laws. This, once again, alludes to the same issues the other states have complained about in their declarations of secession. From here, Atun-Shei now moves on to Texas.
Williamson's words, which called to mind the horrible specter of John Brown's raid with its reference to slave insurrection and Sharp's rifles, may have had an impact. Texas's declaration, drafted early in February, expounded on the idea that not only was slavery at stake, but also white supremacy.
Northern people have formed themselves into a great sectional party, now strong enough in numbers to control the affairs of each of those states, based upon the unnatural feeling of hostility to the southern states and their beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery, proclaiming the debasing doctrine of the equality of all men, irrespective of race or color, a doctrine at war with nature, in opposition to the experience of mankind, and in violation of the plainest revelations of divine law.
The Texas document covers a bit more than the quotation Atun-Shei has used. Namely, they once again list many of the same reasons for why South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, and Alabama have already listed. However, they also include an additional complaint, one which George Williamson has already alluded to. The document states, "The federal government, while but partly under the control of these our unnatural and sectional enemies, has for years almost entirely failed to protect the lives and property of the people of Texas against the Indian savages on our border, and more recently against the murderous forays of banditti from the neighboring territory of Mexico. And while our state government has expended large amounts for such a purpose, the federal government has refused reimbursement therefor, thus rendering our condition more insecure and harassing than it was during the existence of the Republic of Texas." This was an issue that the document mentions twice, indicating that this had been an ongoing problem for many years. Texas was likely going to secede regardless of Williamson's provocations. Now, with the original 7 states discussed, there are a number of issues that are discussed by the secession conventions and mentioned in these declarations of causes for secession. There is a common thread expressed throughout all of these statements and documents that most people might simply ignore for various reasons. Those issues are: first, the violation of the Fugitives of Labor Clause of the Constitution. Second, the violation of the Extradition Clause of the Constitution. Third, the aiding in and support of domestic terrorism in the form of the incitation of servile insurrection, i.e., slave revolt. Fourth, and finally, the North acting as a sectional power bloc, acting in its own interests without the consideration of Southern interests. The issue the South had is not due entirely to the notion of an attack against slavery. Rather, the issues became this prominent because the actions being taken were done in violation of the Compact, the Constitution, and were being done strictly for the benefit of one region of the country, irrespective of the consent of the Southern states. The South took objection to the actions of the North because they were trampling upon the Republic of the Founding Fathers, all for their current issue of the time. Alexander Stephens, in his book A Constitutional View of the Late War Between the States, Its Causes, Character, Conduct, and Results, outlines the reasons for why secession occurred and what exactly the role of slavery was in the matter. On pages 28 through 29, he states, "Slavery, so-called, or the legal subordination of the black race to the white, which existed in all but one of the states when the Union was formed, and in 15 of them when the war began, was unquestionably the occasion of the war, the main exciting proximate cause on both sides, on the one as well as the other. But it was not the real cause, the causa causans of it. That was the assumption on the part of the federal authorities, that the people of the several states were, as you say, citizens of the United States, and owed allegiance to the federal government as the absolute sovereign power over the whole country, consolidated into one nation. The war sprung from the very idea you have expressed, and from the doctrine embraced in the question propounded to me. It grew out of different and directly opposite views as to the nature of the government of the United States, and where, under our system, ultimate sovereign power, or paramount authority, properly resides." These documents discuss slavery because, as Stephens noted, it was the cause of the occasion. It was the issue everyone was going to talk about as the North had latched onto abolition as its political position. However, what underlies this entire debate is the question of the sovereignty of the states and what exactly the role of the federal body was. It was the question of whether a political bloc could force the other states to accept what they wanted through the use of political power, even if it meant outright violating the Constitution of the United States of America, the compact by which all states agreed to follow. This position was alluded to extensively within Georgia's Declaration of Causes. They saw the North utilizing the debate as a means to an end, as a means to enforce their political will upon the southern states and to further exploit the federal government to their own benefit. The North, in their view, was utilizing the federal government as a sledgehammer to impose upon the South what they wanted, irrespective of the consent of the states and the people. It just so happened that slavery was the issue that set these events into motion. As Jefferson Davis stated in his 1864 interview, "It fired the musket which was already capped and loaded." The way Atun-Shei is trying to frame these documents and these remarks is uncharitable at best and downright fraudulent at worst. It is here that he begins to transition from the Deep South and begin to address the Upper South.
Okay, Betty, I'll grant you that there is no debate that the secession of the original 7 Confederate states was to preserve the institution of slavery. Yet it is not until Lincoln calls up 75,000 volunteers to invade, yes, I said invade, those states, that Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina leave the Union.
That's true. The Upper South stayed on the fence for a long time during the secession crisis, and it's not hard to see why. If they left the Union, the northernmost slaveholding states would certainly be hit hardest by the subsequent war. So it made sense that they would hold out for a compromise as long as possible.
So we agree. Slavery was not the sole cause for secession.
No, I never said that. The prospect of abolition and racial equality terrified the whites of the Upper South just as desperately as it did those of the Deep South.
Then why were there slaveholding states in the Union during and after the Civil War?
Because despite the apocalyptic prognostications of the planter class, Lincoln didn't actually want to get rid of slavery in 1860. I mean, haven't you told me that once or twice when you're trying to take Lincoln's reputation as the great emancipator down a peg? But all the slave states of the Upper South, even the border states that ended up staying in the Union, were sharply divided on the issue of secession. In some states, the fire eaters got their way. In others, the Unionists won out.
Plus, the Upper South had a lower population of slaves and one as economically dependent on the institution. That's where your emancipationist historiography falls flat, Billy. It's all about money at the end of the day. Even with slavery, it leads back to the dollar bill, y'all.
The comment brought up here makes a strong, valid case. The Upper South did not secede over the issue of slavery, but over the call for 75,000 troops. The reason why can be better understood, in part, by looking back towards one of the resolutions proposed in Louisiana Secession Convention. The resolution submitted by James Overton Fuqua included the following resolution. Be it further resolved that any attempt by the federal government or others to coerce any state that has seceded or may hereafter secede from the Union will be regarded by Louisiana as an act of war upon all the slaveholding states, and will absolve the state from all allegiances to the federal government, and that in such an emergency Louisiana will make common cause with the state attacked, and resist such coercive measures with all the force at her command. This resolution echoed another concern that came about as a result of the secession crisis, the underlying fear of the government utilizing force in order to coerce the states that seceded from the Union back into the Union against their will. This concern came about due to the ideological beliefs the South held in regard to the formation of the Union. The Union was formed voluntarily by the states with the acceptance of the Constitution. This view was reflected in South Carolina's causes of secession and was mentioned earlier in this video. This much is self-evident when studying the documents. Yet, Atun-Shei arm-twists this notion in two ways. First, he argues that they were on the fence on the matter and had been holding out for a compromise. Second, he argues they would be the most impacted by a conflict. The way he presents this is meant to cast doubt on the point being made, which is rather absurd. For the first point, the Upper South were less so on the fence more than they were trying to resolve a conflict from breaking out to begin with. This is made self-evident by the actions of former President John Tyler in his attempts to negotiate a solution to the problem. The issue that would transpire in a war was more due to the unwillingness of the Republican Party, Lincoln in particular, to deviate from their course of action, not wanting to compromise whatsoever. The sentiment the Deep South had expressed concerning the actions of Lincoln's and the Republican Party's rhetoric was made clear early in 1861. This second point is, rather obviously, an important point to consider. Yet, this doesn't contradict the point brought up. Rather, it emphasizes the secession after Fort Sumter even more. These states did not want a war, but were forced to pick a side. Many of the states of the Upper South chose to secede from the Union due to their opposition to the use of coercion by the federal government. Even states that did not secede, such as Maryland, were still in opposition to the coercion of the South and openly opposed the war. As we covered all the way back in episode 4 of this series, Lincoln illegally arrested a large portion of the Maryland legislature simply for opposing the war that had erupted. Even if you argued that slavery was the main cause for the Deep South seceding from the Union, it was not the reason for the Upper South secession. Their reason, as the original commenter had stated, was due to the call for 75,000 troops. More specifically, their opposition was to the use of force to coerce the Deep South back into the Union based on the belief of the voluntary Union. In spite of this, Atun-Shei decides to counter this by utilizing the tried and true argument of racism as a driving force for their beliefs. This is going to be a point that will be brought up time and again throughout this video. I'm sure my trusty Corvid conductor will have an appropriate number of counterpoints to bring up shortly. In the meantime, Atun-Shei continues, stating the following.
Economics are a big part of it, for sure. But one aspect that's gone critically overlooked is just how enormous a role white supremacy played in all this. When the Upper South was still waffling, the states of the Deep South sent commissioners up north to try to convince their sister slave states to join their newfound confederacy. The commissioners were well aware of the Upper South's political pressure points, and in their letters and speeches, they didn't focus on the economics of slavery. Instead, their pleas placed the preservation of racial hierarchy front and center. As John Smith Preston, South Carolina's commissioner to Virginia, announced to a packed house in Richmond in a speech that February,
"For nearly 30 years, the people of the non-slaveholding states have assailed the institution of African slavery in every form in which our political connection with them permitted them to approach it. During all that period, large masses of abolitionists, maddened by the intoxication of the wildest fanaticism, have associated with the avowed purpose of effecting the abolition of slavery by the most fearful means which can be suggested to a subject race, namely the annihilation of its people by servile insurrection. Southern civilization cannot exist without African slavery. Destroy involuntary labor, and Anglo-Saxon civilization must be remitted to the latitudes whence it sprung.
Preston's speech was frequently interrupted by waves of applause and was widely praised by local newspapers, one of which reported that at one point the whole audience was in tears.
Now, I'm quite curious about this quotation brought up by Atun-Shei. The quote he uses allegedly comes from John Smith Preston, one of the South Carolinian delegates sent to Virginia to her ongoing secession convention. Preston was born and raised as a Virginian, but moved down south to South Carolina, serving as a politician until the secession crisis began. The full speech was written down in the first volume of the Proceedings of the Virginia Secession Convention, a 4-volume series detailing the happenings of the convention. This speech, surpassing 7,000 words in length, was given on February 19th, 1861, and takes up pages 76 to 93, a full 17 pages. After carefully examining this speech, I found that there's an issue with the quotation Atun-Shei uses. The first few sentences are somewhat correct, but still erroneous to what was stated. The section he is paraphrasing from occurs after Preston outlines the legality of secession and the past qualms South Carolina has had with the North. In this section, Preston states the following. "This, gentlemen, brings me directly to the causes which I desire to lay before you. For fully 30 years or more, the people of the northern states have assailed the institution of African slavery. They've assailed African slavery in every form in which, by our contiguity of territory and our political alliance with them, they have been permitted to approach it. During that period of 30 years, large masses of their people have associated themselves together for the purpose of abolishing the institution of African slavery, and means the most fearful were suggested to the subject race, rising and murdering their masters being the charities of those means. In pursuance of this idea, their representatives in the federal government have endeavored by all means that they could bring to bear so to shape the legislation as almost to limit, to restrict, to restrain the slaveholding states from any political interest in the accretion of the government. So that, as my distinguished colleague, Judge Benning, stated to you on yesterday, the decree goes forth that there are to be no more slave states admitted into the Union." As you can tell, the quotation Atun-Shei uses doesn't even line up with what was said, further compounded by the lack of any indication of these changes from the original source. There is the assertion of phrases not mentioned by Preston in his original speech, such as the term servile insurrection, which was not even mentioned once in his statement. Yet, the worst part is the final 2 sentences. Nowhere within this speech did he even utter those words in any way, shape, or form. So, where did he get these lines from? Well, as it turns out, these lines were retrieved from an entirely different copy of the speech. The copy he is quoting from comes from a Columbia, South Carolina publisher and was printed in 1861. This transcript of the speech is likely a heavily edited version from the original speech as given to the Virginia Secession Convention, as it removes several paragraphs and adds in entire paragraphs that weren't stated whatsoever in the Secession Convention's transcript of the speech. In this circumstance, I will be placing more trust with the Secession Convention's transcript of the speech, as it is most likely what was said during the Secession Convention. As I've stated earlier, this speech is a substantial speech with a considerable amount of information provided. This particular section Atun-Shei quoted from only represents one of 4 reasons given by Preston for South Carolina's secession. All 4 points brought up in order are: first, abolitionists inciting slave revolts in the South, inciting slaves to murder their masters. Second, the refusal of the northern states to carry out the provisions in the Constitution. namely the Fugitives of Labor Clause of the Constitution. Third, the failure to return fugitives of the law, namely the participants of John Brown's raid of Harper's Ferry, a point that ties back to point 1. Fourth, and finally, the Northern states imposing their will upon the South, regarding the illegality of slavery through the election of Abraham Lincoln as president. These are the immediate reasons he gives for why they seceded, but prior to this, he outlined a few other points of consideration, namely the mentions of protectionist policies and the North's desire to act of their own accord, all of which further illustrate the growing tension between the two regions of the nation. Several paragraphs before his reasoning, he states the following. In addition to this, it may be stated that at a very early period of the existence of this government, the Northern people, for a variety of causes, entered upon the industries of manufacture and of commerce, but of agriculture scarcely to the extent of self-support. This may have arisen from a variety of causes, among them, perhaps, an uncongenial climate, a barren soil, but an alluring sea-coast adapted to commerce, besides an inherent tendency upon the part of the people of these latitudes to the arts of manufacture and traffic. And while, therefore, it was important that all the sources of the revenue should be kept up to meet the increasing expenses of the government, it also manifestly became of great importance that these articles of manufacture in which they had been engaged should be subject to the purchase of their confederates. They, therefore, invented a system of duties partial and discriminating, by which the whole burden of the revenue from this extraordinary system fell upon those who produced the articles of export, which purchased the articles of imports, and which articles of imports were consumed mainly, or to a great extent, by those who produced the exports. This statement lines up well with Georgia's declaration of causes, which also detailed the origins of the ongoing conflict by addressing the North's propensity to utilize the government for protecting their interests. This conveys through it the nature of the conflict itself and, once more, illustrates Alexander Stephens's point. Slavery is the cause of the occasion, but the causa causa of the conflict is over the question of federal versus national governance. On a final note, Atun-Shei makes a note that the audience applauded this speech, but what he fails to note is where these applauses were occurring. There was little, if any, applauding during this section of the speech. However, there was a particular section that led to rounds of applause from the convention. It went something like this.
Ah, gentlemen of Virginia, whenever outside the borders of Virginia, the voice of a son of Virginia has spoken in this fight, it too has been known because he spoke in the ancient tongue of his mother. I, one of the humblest of her sons, told my countrymen that before the spring grass grows long enough to weave one chaplet of victory, they will hear the sound as of the tramp of a mighty host of men, and they will see floating before that host the banner whose whole history is one blaze of glory, and not one blot of shame. Aye, they will hear coming up from that host one voice like their own, but it will be the resounding echo of that voice which has thundered into the hearts of your godlike sires. Give me liberty or give me death! And on that banner will be written the unsullied name of Virginia.
Yay! Hooray! Yay!
Gentlemen of Virginia, have I promised too much for our mother? To suggest a doubt would be more than blasphemy. I believe she will come. I believe she will take her place, which she has held for 100 years, the foremost of all the world in the ranks of liberty and justice. The world knows her history, and knows no history above it in the niche of fame. And, knowing that history, none dare doubt where Virginia will be when her own offspring, and liberty and justice, call her to the fight.
Hooray!
The section that roused the crowd the most was not any section regarding slavery, but the notion of the fight for liberty and justice, the praise of the nobility of Virginia, and the proclamation of Virginians as champions of that cause. It was that which most stirred the representatives at the Secession Convention, their patriotism for Virginia, their home. As a Virginian myself, reading those lines filled me, a man over 160 years removed from this speech, with a sense of patriotism for the Commonwealth. But would this be enough to sway Virginia to secede from the Union? We'll answer that question soon enough. Atun-Shei continues, stating the following.
Stephen Hale, Alabama's commissioner to Kentucky, left absolutely no room for ambiguity in his letter to Governor Beriah McGuffin.
The triumph of the Republican Party destroys the property of the South, lays waste her fields, and inaugurates all the horrors of a San Domingo servile insurrection, consigning her citizens to assassinations and her wives and daughters to pollution and violation to gratify the lust of half-civilized Africans. The slaveholder and non-slaveholder must ultimately share the same fate. All be degraded to a position of equality with free Negroes, stand side by side with them at the polls, and fraternize in all the social relations of life. Who can look upon such a picture without a shudder? What Southern man, be he slaveholder or non-slaveholder, can without indignation and horror contemplate the triumph of Negro equality?
White supremacy enforced by violent enslavement was so integral to the cultural fabric of the American South, so taken for granted as natural, necessary, and normal by nearly its entire white population, that Mississippi Commissioner William Harris spoke for many when he said,
Mississippi had rather see the last of her race, men, women, and children, immolated in one common funeral pyre, than to see them subjected to the degradation of civil, political, and social equality with the Negro race.
First, with Stephen F. Hale's letter to the Kentucky legislature, presented on December 26, 1860, it is worth noting that Atun-Shei ignores a couple of key lines from the statement. Namely, his quotation cuts off half of one sentence and ignores most of the rest of the paragraph following it. In this letter, Hale states, Who can look upon such a picture without a shudder? What Southern man, be he slaveholder or non-slaveholder, can without indignation and horror contemplate the triumph of Negro equality, and see his own sons and daughters, in the not-distant future, associated with free Negroes upon terms of political and social equality, and the white man stripped by the heaven-daring hand of fanaticism of that title to superiority over the black race which God himself has bestowed. In the northern states, where free Negroes are so few as to form no appreciable part of the community, in spite of all the legislation for their protection, they still remain a degraded caste, excluded by the band of society from social association with all but the lowest and most degraded of the white race. But in the South, where in many places the African race largely predominates, and as a consequence, the two races would be continually pressing together, amalgamation or the extermination of one or the other would be inevitable. Can Southern men submit to such degradation and ruin? God forbid that they should. The rest of the paragraph brings up an interesting point that is simply not considered when discussing the matter, the lack of consequences faced by the North in regards to their position. the North had a significantly smaller black population in general, and, in spite of the machinations of the abolitionist movement, were still treated as a subordinate race. In effect, he is inferring through this statement that the North wishes to impose on the South what the North has not done herself. The North is completely free of the consequences of their policies and actions, while the South has to face them directly. This expresses one of the earlier concerns mentioned in the causes of secession from Mississippi, the lack of any real plan by the abolitionists to deal with the enslaved population without causing conflict. Second, with William L. Harris's speech, what is said is, for once, a word-for-word statement. However, in both cases, Atun-Shei has to pass over considerable details expressed through the documents, particularly their explanations for why secession occurred. All of what they said concerning the matter is, once again, boiled down to the same analysis I presented earlier on. Their secession was driven by the actions of the sectional Northern Party, which consisted of the violations of the Constitution, the compact they agreed to follow, in order to assert their will upon the slavery debate, and in turn, every other issue of note. What I find to be truly annoying, however, is how Atun-Shei continually doubles down on the white supremacy argument as his crutch and wheelchair. I mean, he must be absolutely correct, and the northern population never said a terrible thing whatsoever about the black population and the people who championed for any form of equality. Wait, I believe Mr. Crow has finally prepared his slanderous symphony for us. All right, take it away, Mr. Crow. Wow, that's a lot of racism. Well, that's what you asked for. Cool. Well, I think I might need to see an audiologist. Anyways, I believe Mr. Crow made his point abundantly clear either way. If the South were white supremacists for those remarks, then everyone of that time can be classified as white supremacists. It was only a few select groups, true radicals, that championed for equality of the races. Oftentimes, those radicals turned out not to be the best people like John Osawatomie Brown or Karl Marx. This is the problem with applying modern terminology towards those of the past. Everyone can fit into the categories presented by modernist interpretations of morality, especially when those morals, a term I use very loosely here, are structured on secular concepts rather than Christian theological principles. Of course, most people are going to say that Hale's and Harris's remarks are not in line with the beliefs of our times. But so were most everyone's beliefs of that time. So, why make this into a point at all? Simple. Atun-Shei's making this into a point because he is being uncharitable towards these figures simply because they chose the wrong side of history. It is just another disingenuous position he has adopted on top of the other dirty tactics we've seen thus far. And now we finally begin addressing the secession of the Upper South, starting with Virginia. Atun-Shei continues, stating the following.
So what kind of effect did the Commissioner's overtures and the broader zeitgeist of white supremacist fervor have on the states of the Upper South? Well, we only need to look at their declarations of secession to find out. Virginia was finally forced to choose a side after South Carolina militia fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861. Just days earlier, the state's secession convention had declared that,
whereas African slavery is a vital part of the social system of the states wherein it exists, and as that form of servitude existed when the Union was formed, and the jurisdiction of the several states over it within their respective limits was recognized by the Constitution, any interference to its prejudice by the federal authority, or by the authorities of other states, or by the people thereof, is in derogation from plain right, contrary to the Constitution, offensive and dangerous.
That seems to me like an argument ultimately stemming from states' rights.
I would argue that it's more of a reflection of the Southern rights nationalism we talked about in episode 8, but yeah, Virginia was on the whole much more moderate. There you had lots of influential pro-slavery unionists like your boy Bobby Lee, who in 1860 believed that preserving slavery from outside interference was absolutely essential, but decried the Deep South's actions as illegal and revolutionary. Virginia's delegates on the secession convention were shrewd politicians. They knew that white supremacist fear-mongering alone wasn't enough to win over the moderates, but a strong argument made for the constitutionality of secession just might.
What Atun-Shei is citing in this section does not come from any causes of secession. Rather, this comes from a resolution proposed on March 28, 1861, which can be found in Volume 2 of the Virginia Secession Convention Proceedings. The statement Atun-Shei reads is the full statement, but it is only the second part of the full resolution. The first part of the resolution stated, "Be it resolved and declared by the people of the state of Virginia in convention assembled, that the states which composed the United States of America when the federal Constitution was formed were independent sovereignties, and in adopting that instrument the people of each state agreed to associate with the people of the other states, upon a footing of exact equality. It is the duty, therefore, of the common government to respect the rights of the states and the equality of the people thereof, and, within the just limits of the Constitution, to protect, with equal care, the great interests that spring from the institutions of each." This first part, a section that was debated over extensively during the 38th session of the convention, sets up the reasoning for the second part of the resolution. It establishes that the states were independent sovereignties that entered into the Union with the common agreement of being the equals of those of the other states. It also affirms that the federal government is to respect the rights of the states and the people within the limitations of the Constitution. Atun-Shei references this 8th episode of his series, where he attempts to assert that the South just wanted state-enforced tyranny. However, this section contradicts the argument he attempted to present. Rather, what the South wanted was for the states to have the right to determine domestic issues within their own jurisdiction, as long as these matters did not violate the Constitution. Slavery fell under the purview of the rights of the states to determine only with the exceptions stipulated within the Constitution, that being the question of fugitives of labor. The Southern philosophy of governance was built upon the principle of the sovereignty of the states, which could better represent the will of the people than the federal body. The reasoning behind this is simple enough. It is much easier for the people to hold local and state officials accountable for their actions than it is to hold a federal official. As a result, state and local politicians better represent the will of the people due to their close proximity to them. The exception to this rule would be in cases involving interstate conflicts. This is where the Constitution would step in, providing an outline for what was required of the states. It acted as a compact between the states within the Union, binding the states to a particular set of rules and regulations that would govern their actions. The Bill of Rights, a document that was incorporated due to the protests of Virginians to the Constitution without such provisions, offers an amendment of vital importance, the 10th Amendment. It states that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. This amendment reinforces the position of the Virginians in many of the southern states. The states would have the right to dictate domestic matters, as these matters had not been claimed by the federal body, nor were they prohibited by the Constitution, including the question of the legality of slavery. The second part of the resolution simply affirmed what was already an accepted part of common law, and explained why it was wrong for the federal body to impose itself upon the matter. In short, it was not the federal government's right to trifle with the matter, nor did they have the power to trifle with it. Any transgression on the matter would be a violation of the sovereignty of the states, of the compact the states agreed to, and the rights of the people. This same line of reasoning can be found in most of the causes of secession documents and was commonly expressed by all the political leaders, thus reinforcing Stephens's statement. Now, let's address a question that I had posited earlier. When these delegates from the southern states went to Virginia to posit their ideas for secession, did Virginia initially vote for secession because of their provocations? Well, as it turns out, no, they did not. On April 4th, 1861, a resolution totaling over 1,500 words in length was proposed. This was an ordinance concerning the secession of the Commonwealth of Virginia from the Union. After some debate, much of which involved Henry A. Wise, it was put up for a vote. The Secession Convention voted against the ordinance of secession with 45 yeas and 88 nays, meaning over 2/3 of the delegation were opposed to secession. Those who opposed secession included William Ballard Preston, Secretary of the Navy under Zachary Taylor's presidency, Peter Carr Johnson, officer during the War of 1812 and former general of Virginia's militia, Marmaduke Johnson, who would later become a lieutenant colonel in the Army of Northern Virginia, Williams Carter Wickham, who would later serve under Jeb Stuart and participate in the peace negotiations of 1864, and Jubal Anderson Early, who would later become a corps commander in the Army of Northern Virginia and lead an army during the Shenandoah Campaign of 1864. The reason for this opposition was simple. They did not believe secession could be justified at that point in time. War had not broken out yet, and there was still hope that the Virginia delegation attempting to negotiate a compromise to resolve the conflict could bring a peaceful resolution to the situation. However, this was thoroughly crushed with the firing on Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for 75,000 troops. On April 16th, 4 days after the events of Fort Sumter and immediately 1 day after Lincoln's call for 75,000 troops, William Ballard Preston proposed the following resolution. An ordinance to repeal the ratification of the Constitution of the United States of America by the state of Virginia and to resume all the rights and powers granted under said Constitution. The people of Virginia and the ratification of the Constitution of the United States of America, adopted by them in convention on the 25th day of June in the year of our Lord 1788, having declared that the powers granted under the said Constitution were derived from the people of the United States, and might be resumed whensoever the same should be perverted to their injury and oppression, and the federal government having perverted said powers, not only to the injury of the people of Virginia, but to the oppression of the southern slaveholding states. Now, therefore, we the people of Virginia do declare and ordain that the ordinance adopted by the people of this state in convention on the 25th day of June in the year of our Lord, 1788, whereby the Constitution of the United States of America was ratified, and all acts of the General Assembly of this state ratifying or adopting amendments to said Constitution are hereby repealed and abrogated. That the union between the state of Virginia and the other states under the Constitution aforesaid is hereby dissolved, and that the state of Virginia is in the full possession and exercise of all the rights of sovereignty which belong and appertain to a free and independent state. And they do further declare that said Constitution of the United States of America is no longer binding on any of the citizens of the state. This ordinance shall take effect and be an act of this day when ratified by a majority of the votes of the people of this state cast at a poll to be taken thereon on the 4th Thursday in May next, in pursuance of a schedule hereafter to be enacted. Done in convention in the city of Richmond on the 17th day of April in the year of our Lord, 1861, and in the 85th year of the Commonwealth of Virginia. This ordinance would come to a vote on April 17, 1861. This time, the convention would vote for secession with 88 yeas and 55 nays. Williams, Carter Wickham, and Jubal Early would still vote nay. This strong reversal is best expressed by the ordinance of secession itself. The main contention Virginia had was not with slavery, but with the very thing referenced in one of Louisiana's ordinances, the use of force to coerce the South back into the Union. This act alone was what drove Virginia towards secession. In essence, the quote used earlier on stands as the truth. Virginia secession was motivated by the use of force to coerce the southern states back into the Union, as that act was an overt act of tyranny in the eyes of Virginian delegates. Virginia did not secede over slavery, nor did it secede over some vague notion of white supremacy. It seceded because Lincoln was using lethal force to coerce the southern states that had seceded back into the Union, crossing a line that the Virginian delegation could never tolerate. As for his remarks on Lee and other Virginian politicians being pro-slavery Unionists, it represents a complete and utter failure to understand Lee, the man, above all else. Lee was by no means pro-slavery. As I've referenced back in episode 7 of Checkmate, Atun-Shei, Lee was very much against slavery, calling it a moral and political evil in personal letters prior to the outbreak of the war. His most oft-quoted statement is a perfect embodiment of Lee's personality. Lee, much like with many Virginians, did not want a war. However, he had no control over this. That power lied with Lincoln and his administration. Lincoln, in the end, made war an inevitability with his response to Fort Sumter, which forced the Virginians to choose either to remain in the Union and be subject to Lincoln's rule, a rule that over 98% of Virginians did not want, or secede from the Union and defend themselves. Virginia chose the latter. Atun-Shei's argument here is a perfect example of how much information he leaves out when presenting his arguments. All throughout the series, he has cherry-picked his arguments, only finding the most objectionable statements he can, firmly contained in single quotations, and present those as the norm, as the only way you can view the situation. In truth, as with all historical matters, nothing is ever as straightforward as it seems. Careful analysis of the secession of Virginia demonstrates exactly why you shouldn't take what this man says at face value. Atun-Shei continues, stating the following.
On May 6th, Arkansas, which had been vainly attempting all winter and spring to broker a compromise, finally took the plunge and declared independence. Its secession convention had already written a document explaining their reasons.
People of the northern states have organized a political party. purely sectional in character, the central and controlling idea of which is hostility to the institution of African slavery. They have, in disregard of their constitutional obligation, obstructed the faithful execution of the fugitive slave laws by enactments of their state legislatures. They have degraded American citizens by placing them upon an equality with Negroes.
Now, let's first examine the quotes Atun-Shei is used here. These quotes come from a resolution that was passed by the Arkansas Secession Convention on March 20th, 1861, which furnished a list of reasons for their current concern with the federal body. The first quotation only takes into account the first part of the first stated reason. The statement in its full context reads as follows. The people of the northern states have organized a political party, purely sectional in its character, the central and controlling idea of which is hostility to the institution of African slavery, as it exists in the southern states, and that party has elected a president and vice president of the United States, pledged to administer the government upon principles inconsistent with the rights and subversive of the interests of the people of the southern states. From here, he jumps down to the fourth reason stated by the resolution. To summarize the reasons stated in the document, reason number 2 lists several points, including the denial of allowing for slave owners to move from state to state with their slave property, as addressed in the Dred Scott decision. They have declared that the country can only be either wholly free or wholly slave, and the issue of surrendering Negro thieves, as they described it, for violation of the law, thereby failing to follow their constitutional obligations. The third point specifically discusses how the sectional party in question has declared that Congress has the right to dictate whether slavery will be legal or not just within the territories, but within any federal property, including within slave states. The quotation Atun-Shei uses is the whole statement, though he seemingly wants to brush off the fact they openly state their contention is with the violation of the Constitution to impose their will upon this issue. The final quotation he used jumps again to point 6. So for the sake of consistency, it is important we cover point 5, which addresses the same issue of the right of slave owners to transit through free states with their property. Now, for the third quotation, his statement ends up leaving out a tiny bit of information, only 4 words that add a level of context. Point 6 reads as follows. They have degraded American citizens by placing them upon an equality with Negroes at the ballot box. What this statement is actually saying is the northern states want to grant the black population the right to vote. This point was even controversial among many Northerners, including prominent Union generals such as William Tecumseh Sherman, who overtly stated that blacks should be held in a subordinate state and not be granted the right to vote. This point was to shine light on the radical nature of the Republican Party's policies at the time, which diverged considerably from the zeitgeist of the time. Yet, in spite of all of this, Arkansas's secession convention was largely dominated by Unionists who, in the very same document Atun-Shei is quoting from, had attempted to negotiate a peaceful resolution to the crisis. However, as with the Virginians, their attempts to prevent a conflict failed, and, as with the Virginians, the call for 75,000 troops by Lincoln to coerce the South back into the Union was the tipping point. On May 6, 1861, they would pass an ordinance that would formalize their secession from the Union. Their main reasoning is listed as follows. Whereas, in addition to the well-founded cause of complaint set forth by this convention, and resolutions adopted on the 11th of March, A.D. 1861, against the sectional party now in power in Washington City, headed by Abraham Lincoln, he has, in face of resolutions passed by this convention pledging the state of Arkansas to resist to the last extremity any attempt on the part of such power to coerce any state that had seceded from the old Union, proclaimed to the world that war should be waged against such states until they should be compelled to submit to their rule, and large forces to accomplish this have by this same power been called out and are now being marshaled to carry out this inhuman design. And to longer submit to such rule or remain in the old Union of the United States would be disgraceful and ruinous to the state of Arkansas. What finally convinced Arkansas to overwhelmingly vote for secession was not white supremacy, nor slavery, but Lincoln's call for 75,000 troops to coerce the South into the Union. Just as with Virginia, Atun-Shei is being manipulative with the motivations for secession of the Upper South. Atun-Shei continues, now discussing North Carolina, stating the following.
Like Virginia, North Carolina also had strong Unionist sentiments, especially in the mountainous western part of the state, where the terrain made large-scale plantation slavery impossible. After the attack on Fort Sumter, Governor John Ellis finally called the secession convention with the following proclamation. It is nearly unique among secession documents in that it makes no mention of slavery directly.
I am informed that Abraham Lincoln has made a call for 75,000 men to be employed for the invasion of the peaceful homes of the South. United action in defense of the sovereignty of North Carolina and of the rights of the South becomes now the duty of all.
The section Atun-Shei is quoting from comes from a proclamation by Governor John W. Ellis of North Carolina. This proclamation was issued on April 17, 1861, and a copy of the full transcript can be found in the Papers of John W. Ellis, specifically on page 621 of Volume 2. Atun-Shei, as he has done with many of these quotations, leaves out a considerable amount of the original statement. The full proclamation reads as follows. Whereas, by proclamation of Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, followed by a requisition of Simon Cameron, Secretary of War, I'm informed that the said Abraham Lincoln has made a call for 75,000 men to be employed for the invasion of the peaceful homes of the South, and for the violent subversion of the liberties of a free people, constituting a large part of the whole population of the late United States. And whereas this high-handed act of tyrannical outrage is not only in violation of all constitutional law and utter disregard of every sentiment of humanity in Christian civilization, and conceived in a spirit of aggression unparalleled by any act of recorded history, but is a direct step towards the subjugation of the whole South, and the conversion of a free republic, inherited from our fathers, into a military despotism, to be established by worse than foreign enemies on the ruins of our once glorious Constitution of equal rights. Now, therefore, I, John W. Ellis, Governor of the State of North Carolina, for these extraordinary causes, do hereby issue this, my proclamation, notifying and requesting the senators and members of the House of Commons of the General Assembly of North Carolina to meet in special session at the Capitol, in the city of Raleigh, on Wednesday, the 1st day of May next. And I furthermore exhort all good citizens throughout the state to be mindful of their first allegiance is due to the sovereignty which protects their homes and dearest interests, as their first service is due for the sacred defense of their hearths and of the soil which holds the graves of our glorious dead. United action in defense of the sovereignty of North Carolina and of the rights of the South becomes now the duty of all. By the time Ellis issued this proclamation for the Assembly of North Carolina's legislature, there had been a flurry of reports flooding his desk about what actions are to be taken. Ellis is providing orders to the commanders of the various militia units throughout North Carolina, including issuing orders to John H. Cook to seize the federal arsenal in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and to Marshal D. Creighton to hold his positions along the coast. In addition, he receives a resignation letter from Jesse Jenkins, magistrate of Cleveland County, North Carolina, and future captain of Company E of the 12th North Carolina Infantry Regiment, stating that he will not render assistance to the civil authority of the Republican administration. All this transpires on the very same day his proclamation is issued. The previous orders issued by Ellis were prompted by a letter he had received from the Secretary of War, which requested he furnish troops in the suppression of the southern states. In response to the request, he stated, "Your dispatch is received, and, if genuine, which its extraordinary character leads me to doubt, I have to say in reply that I regard the levy of troops made by the administration for the purpose of subjugating the states of the South as in violation of the Constitution, and as a gross usurpation of power. I can be no hasty to this wicked violation of the laws of the country, and to this war upon the liberties of a free people. You can get no troops from North Carolina. I will reply in more detail when I receive your call in the mail." Just as with Virginia and Arkansas, the final tipping point was the call for 75,000 troops, which, as with the others, North Carolina interpreted as an act of coercion and a gross violation of the rights of the people. Atun-Shei addresses Tennessee, stating the following.
Tennessee had a large population of Appalachian Unionists too, but their secession documents were far more radical. A month before they officially seceded, the state legislature issued a public address to its citizens, declaring their intention to do so.
Tennessee has taken her position and has proudly determined to throw her banners to the breeze, and will give her strength to the sacred cause of freedom for the white man of the South.
As we should be familiar with by this point in time, Atun-Shei has a knack for selecting singular quotations from a given work and passing them off as the only thing that was stated within them. For Tennessee's letter addressing the people of the state, this quotation is potentially the most egregious. The quote in question, which appears at the end of the letter, consists of 48 words. The full length is over 3,600 words in length. The letter, which is featured in the second journal of the second extra session of the 33rd General Assembly of the state of Tennessee, can be found between pages 83 and 91, or a little over 8 pages long. This letter, published on May 6, 1861, addresses numerous issues and makes very few mentions of slavery. Instead, most of the complaints it lists are concerning Lincoln's administration and their actions concerning the events that led to Fort Sumter and the subsequent response. Those complaints are as follows. He caused it to be given out that he would abandon Fort Sumter, when, at the very time, he was privately preparing a powerful armament for its relief. Under false pretenses, he introduced an officer into Fort Sumter, who took advantage of the privilege to concert a plan of relief with the commandment of that fortress. Congress refused to vote $1 for the prosecution of hostilities against the people of the South. He and his agents got the appropriation by falsehood, pretending that it was needed to pay off the government debt, and instead of so using it, fails to pay even the maimed and wounded soldier his pension, or the hard-working census-taker his salary, but scatters it among a brutal soldiery whom he has hired to murder Southern freemen and to desecrate Southern soil. Congress refused to pass a coercion bill. Yet this contemptible usurper proclaims war against the South in defiance of the Constitution, in violation of his oath, and his oft-repeated and positive pledges to the contrary. Congress would not authorize the call for a single soldier, yet, in the face of the laws and the Constitution, this petty tyrant calls for armies of immense magnitude to march against peaceful and unoffending citizens. He assured Tennessee members of Congress that his policy would be peaceful. His premier, W.H. Seward, announced such to be the purpose of his cabinet on every occasion. And yet, after lulling the people to repose, he impudently called upon the governor of Tennessee for troops to follow his standard in a war of subjugation against their own native section. The Mississippi River is declared to be free by the Constitution of Tennessee, and yet this vile usurper stations troops at Cairo to obstruct the navigation of its great highway and its tributaries, and these miserable instruments are now engaged in making war upon the commerce of non-seceding states. Tennessee, ever loyal to the Constitution, has been an advocate for peace, and has struggled to bring together the broken fragments of the Union. Yet, in the midst of her well-meant efforts, a war is made upon her. Every avenue of trade is closed up, and the people are suffering all the privations of a blockade. Not even provisions demanded by the necessities of the people are allowed to be shipped into the state, and property of private individuals is made subject to piratical and illegal seizure. Boats have been plundered of their cargoes by authority of the government, and when called on for an explanation by the governor of Tennessee, even the honor of a reply is refused. The states that desire to live in the Union, and to be on good terms of friendship with all, are insultingly told that neutrality is impossible, and that they must aid in the ungodly war of subjugation, or else suffer the penalties. Had Tennessee ever desired to remain neutral, the miserable and degraded privilege is denied to her by the tyrants that assume to rule in the name of the Constitution. The Confederate States sought for peace, and sent their agents to the federal capital to consummate that object. They were assured that peace would be made, and while resting under the belief that they were dealing with honorable men, Lincoln and his cabinet were secretly collecting an immense armament for the relief of Fort Sumter. It is a matter of no importance who fired the first gun in the attack on Fort Sumter. The war commenced when a hostile fleet set sail upon its mission of death. Lincoln pretends in his inaugural that his only object is to protect the property of the nation, yet he organizes immense armies all along the lines of the border slave states, commissions them to seize and take the property of private citizens, holds Maryland in subjugation by the aid of her treacherous governor and his armed hirelings, and converts the federal capital into an entrenched camp, and subjects it to all the rigors of martial law. Tennessee's chief complaint was exactly that of Virginia, North Carolina, and Arkansas. Lincoln's use of force to coerce the South back into the Union was an egregious violation of the rights and liberties of the Southern states. He lacked the authority to do this, and in doing so, he set the country towards despotism. And it was the actions of Lincoln that convinced Tennesseans to vote for secession and join the Confederate States of America. The original commenter was undeniably correct by stating that the Upper South did not secede over slavery. These states made it evidently clear that their reason for secession was due to Lincoln's coercion of the South, not for any love of an institution. With the secession of all the Southern states addressed, we can now see what, exactly, Alexander Stephens had referred to. Slavery is mentioned in many of these documents, more so in some than in others, and can be considered a cause of the war. But slavery alone cannot explain why these events transpired as they did. The causa causan of the conflict is not about slavery in of itself. That has to be attributed to the question of the authority of the federal government concerning any of these matters. The problem can best be summarized with the following question. Does the federal government have the authority to dictate this issue? The North argued in the affirmative. They believed that the federal body had the right to dictate the slavery debate and, by extension, any and all other issues. The reason was rooted in Hamiltonian central governance, this being the belief that the government has the authority to intervene in domestic matters. This included the passage of protectionist tariffs, designed to protect the industries of the North, thus enabling their economic prosperity, and the legality of the institution of slavery. The South, by contrast, responded negatively. They held the earnest belief that ultimate sovereignty lied with the states. This view was initially spawned from the Jeffersonian Farmers' Republic idealism, arguing instead that the federal government had no right to dictate domestic matters, especially on matters attributed as rights of the states. The strong opposition towards protectionist tariffs and abolition of slavery in the territories was rooted in this particular worldview. Thus, slavery alone cannot explain the causes of the war. Many years ago, when I began studying the American Civil War, I asked a question. Why was it that the United States was the only country to have allegedly fought a war over slavery? After all, in England, the slavery question had been settled without any blood spilled, nor was blood spilled over this issue in the rest of Europe. So, why was it only the United States? The answer to that question is this. Slavery by itself cannot cause a war. It requires the conjunction of multiple issues to make slavery into such a contentious issue to begin with. Thusly, we must conclude that slavery cannot be considered the sole cause of the conflict, but as a part of a complex web of fundamental flaws with the political system and the ideological worldviews of the geographic regions of the United States of America. To argue otherwise would require a dismissal of the other problems with the system, thus breeding the most virulent form of the complex cause fallacy I've dubbed reductio ad servitutem, or reduced to slavery. With this point addressed, I wish to address another question that many of you are likely thinking to yourselves. Where exactly did Atun-Shei get these quotes from, and why are many of these quotes butchered as they are? This is a perplexing question, even for me. He cited from several books, the first being The Confederate and Neo-Confederate Reader, The Great Truth About the Lost Cause by James W. Lowen and Edward H. Sebesta. This book, in spite of these authors having their biases, shall we say, includes the whole text of the secession documents for the reader to read for themselves. The other book he cites from is Apostles of Disunion, Southern Secession Commissioners and the Causes of the Civil War by Charles B. Dew. What I find interesting about this particular citation is that Dew, in his introduction, acknowledges that there is a considerable amount of scholarly debate over the causes of the war, citing a number of historical authors who point towards different issues that led to the secession crisis. Ultimately, what paved the way for Atun-Shei's bad quotations is Atun-Shei himself. The quote mining on display is entirely the making of Atun-Shei. For instance, the lack of any specific dates for the quotations, shortchanging the full name of the January 7th Ordinance of the Florida Convention, and referencing a book that included them rather than simply citing them via free online copies of the documents added considerable difficulty in checking the citation in question. All of this is simply sloppy work on Atun-Shei's part. Worse than this is the doctoring of several quotations, either by cobbling together sentences from entirely different paragraphs or simply omitting half of the paragraph, which was done to give off the wrong impression of the original statements. All of this is sloppy scholarship. There is no excuse for Atun-Shei to not double-check his citations either. He had 18 months to prepare for this video. To make matters worse, we're still not done yet with this video. He continues, stating the following.
Sir, I'm afraid that you are confusing the causes of war with the cause of secession. The two are linked, but not the same. Secession may have been about slavery, but the decision to inaugurate war was entirely Lincoln's. The Federals could have just let the South peaceably go.
Johnny, buddy, you're my brother and I love you, but that's incredibly fucking naive. Nation-states will always act in the interests of self-preservation if it's at all within their power to do so. Even cute, cuddly democratic ones with inspiring quotes about liberty and justice for all printed in their passports.
But it doesn't have to be that way.
I'm with you, man, and look, I'm not trying to make a moral judgment about it or be cynical here, but that's kind of just the way the cookie crumbles. And when you look at the circumstances of the secession crisis, it's hard to imagine Lincoln acting in any other way than he did. The balkanization of America was a truly existential threat to the federal government. Prominent Confederates were very open about their plans to eclipse the United States as a continental power. Secession was such a severe blow to national pride, such an egregious insult to the federal government's efficacy and credibility, that it demanded an equally drastic response.
But there were people at the time, North and South, who criticized Lincoln's call for troops and believed that the whole thing could be resolved peacefully.
I would argue that even in the context of the time, and without the benefit of hindsight, these people had delusions of constitutional grandeur. Everybody with their head on straight in 1860 and 61 knew that secession would be an armed conflict of some kind. They knew it. And for the fire eaters of the South, a civil war was a far lesser calamity when compared to the prospect of racial equality. They believed the explicitly white supremacist Herrenvolk democracy of the new Confederacy was well worth fighting for.
War was not an inevitability. The only one who made it into inevitability was Abraham Lincoln. As Tennessee and Virginia had noted during their secession convention proceedings, Lincoln was acting with malicious intent while the South attempted to find a peaceful resolution to the situation. John Tyler, former President of the United States, along with a large delegation of upper Southern states and a delegation from the states that had seceded, had attempted to negotiate a resolution that would avert conflict. He could have just as easily preserved the nation by using the pen rather than the sword. However, as noted in the letter to the people of Tennessee, Lincoln chose not to pursue a peaceful resolution to the situation. Lincoln chose to escalate the situation by threatening to resupply Fort Sumter rather than attempt to alleviate the situation there. He pursued an aggressive course, one that would lead to the coercion of the southern states to the point of actively misappropriating government funds to facilitate the armament and establishment of troops. When presented with a choice, Lincoln chose the most aggressive path possible, one that would lead to war. All Lincoln had to do was not incite a conflict, instead brokering a compromise that would resolve the situation without a drop of blood spilled. After all, Andrew Jackson had done much the same less than 3 decades prior, during the nullification crisis. It was not out of the question that the war could have been avoided. The problem was Lincoln had no intention of avoiding one. He acted to incite a conflict, and the South knew it, which is why they wrote about these actions as grievances. Ultimately, blame for the war lies squarely on Lincoln's lap. His initial rhetoric and election to the presidency was the incident, the final straw for the secession crisis. He was going to be the one most responsible for what would transpire next. He was in the position of power and authority to determine whether a conflict would happen or not. In this position, Lincoln opted to escalate to a conflict, even though there were options for him to take that would have avoided such a conflict. He can talk all he wants about the radicals. As I stated back in episode 8, radicals are radicals. They constitute a small portion of the overall population and of the delegations that met. However, this doesn't change the fact Lincoln was the one man who could have prevented a war, but chose not to do so. The point remains, Lincoln is most responsible for a secession crisis boiling over into a civil war. Now, Atun-Shei finally delves into Alexander Stephens and the namesake for this video, stating the following.
The most famous evangelist of this new vision of American government in 1861 was ironically a man who had up until then been a staunch Unionist, Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens. On March 21, 1861, a crowd of 2,000 people gathered in the Athenaeum Theater in Savannah, Georgia, to hear Stephens speak about the core principles of the fledgling Confederacy. He had only just returned home to Georgia after attending the Confederate Constitutional Convention in Montgomery, Alabama, wherein he had played a major role. Mounting the stage to a thunderous applause, he said,
"We are in the midst of one of the greatest epochs of our history. The last 90 days will mark one of the most memorable eras in the history of modern civilization. Many governments have been founded on the principles of subordination and serfdom of certain classes of the same race. Such were and are in violation of nature's laws. Our system commits no such violation. With us, the white race, however high or low, rich or poor, are equal in the eyes of the law. Not so with the Negro. Subordination is his place."
I suspected the Cornerstone speech would rear its ugly head at some point in this episode. Are you going to conveniently leave out the part where Stephens talks about tariffs?
Yeah, he's got a few tariff zingers in there, which is also kind of ironic because he was in favor of protectionism for most of his political career. Like we've talked about before, protectionist tariffs didn't do the South any favors. Doesn't change the fact that slavery was the reason for secession.
Yeah, but all that racist stuff was just like Alexander Stephens' opinion, man. It's not like he was speaking for every Confederate ever.
How is this an outlying opinion after all the other quotes that I've just shown you? Stephens had his finger on the pulse of the white South and he knew it.
But what you Yankees fail to mention was that the Cornerstone speech was improvised. The Vice President did not have prepared remarks that evening.
No, but he had given near-identical speeches a number of times in the weeks prior, namely in Atlanta and Augusta, where he used the same white supremacist rhetoric and was met with the same enthusiastic reception.
Okay, but I heard that President Davis was dismayed at the lack of political tact exhibited by his vice president. To Davis's amazement, Stephens bypassed the all-important constitutional guarantee of state rights and emphasized the institution of slavery. Could anything, he wondered, have been more calculated to damage the Confederate cause, both in the North and abroad, than his vice president's unfortunate speech?
Yeah, I've heard that rumor too. Trouble is there's no primary source documentation to prove it. And as far as I can tell, it was made up in the 1950s. Do you have one?
What?
Do you have any primary source documentation to back up what you're saying there, bud?
No. No, I guess not.
And if it did bother Davis when Confederate politicians speechified in defense of slavery, then he sure didn't practice what he preached. Just a few weeks later, Davis gave an address to the Confederate Congress in which he said,
"The Republican Party seeks not to promote the general welfare or ensure domestic tranquility, but to awaken the bitterest hatred against the citizens of sister states by violent denunciations of their institutions. In moral and social condition, the African slaves
slaves have been elevated from brutal savages into docile, intelligent, and civilized agricultural laborers, and supplied not only with bodily comforts, but with careful religious instruction. Under the supervision of a superior race, their labor has been so directed as not only to allow a gradual and marked amelioration of their own condition, but to convert hundreds of thousands of square miles of the wilderness into cultivated lands, covered with a prosperous people.
Johnny, my dear friend, in the Cornerstone speech, Alexander Stephens revealed what lay at the heart of the Confederate experiment. In the words of historian Charles Dew, the absolute conviction that the abolition of slavery would either plunge the South into a race war or so stain the blood of the white race that it would be contaminated for all time. The slave republic of the Confederate States would emulate the revolutionary struggle of the Founding Fathers, but fix what they believed had been their biggest mistake. As Stephens put it,
the prevailing ideas of the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This was an error. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and moral condition.
It is important to consider here the nature of the Cornerstone speech. Of utmost importance to consider, our main transcript of the speech comes from a reporter who attended the speech and recorded it as he had heard it. In the end of the speech, the reporter himself notes that the report is not a perfect transcript, which is indicated by several sections of generalizations of some of Stephens' statements in the latter half of the speech. However, as this is potentially one of the only examples we have of what was said at Savannah, we will have to go with it. To this end, I believe briefly overviewing the Savannah speech, as Stephens referred to it, is in order. Stephens, who is in the middle of a large theater in Savannah, begins by noting the importance of the event in question, though, in the early portion of the speech, he is continually interrupted by the clamor of the crowd, many of whom are outside of the building demanding he go to the front steps to speak. However, Stephens remains inside during the duration of this speech, partially due to his advanced age and due to the clamoring of the women in the crowd, many of whom object to going outside. He addresses the crowd by stating that he wishes to present a number of the changes made to the Confederate Constitution, but first affirms that many of the basics of the Constitution of the United States are maintained within the new document. But of greater importance are the changes made to it, which addresses the different grievances the Confederacy had had with the old system. First, Stephens discusses industrial favoritism, stating, "The question of building up class interest, or fostering one branch of industry to the prejudice of another under the exercise of the revenue power, which gave us so much trouble under the old Constitution, is put at rest forever under the new. We allow the imposition of no duty with a view of giving advantage to one class of persons, in any trade or business, over those of another. All under our system stand upon the same broad principles of perfect equality. Honest labor and enterprise are left free and unrestricted in whatever pursuit they may be engaged." Second, Stephens touches upon the question of appropriating national funds for internal improvements, stating, "Again, the subject of internal improvements, under the power of Congress to regulate commerce, is put at rest under our system. The power claimed by construction under the old Constitution was at least a doubtful one. It rested solely upon construction. We of the South, generally apart from considerations of constitutional principles, opposed its exercise upon grounds of its inexpediency and injustice. Notwithstanding this opposition, millions of money from the common treasury have been drawn for such purposes. Our opposition sprang from no hostility to commerce or any necessary aids for facilitating it. With us, it was simply a question upon whom the burden should fall. In this section, he spends some time explaining the issue of using federal funds to finance infrastructure projects in other states. This was seen as a problem as the people of the state who paid the taxes for the project will not receive the benefit from the project in question. This is best summarized in an example Stephens provides. What justice was there in taking this money which our people paid into the common treasury on the importation of our iron and applying it to the improvement of rivers and harbors elsewhere? Stephens spends a considerable amount of time discussing this specific point, likely due to it being an important issue to the Georgian delegation. Third, he discusses some changes to how cabinets function, stating, "Another feature to which I will allude is that the new Constitution provides that cabinet ministers and heads of departments may have the privilege of seats upon the floor of the Senate and the House of Representatives, may have the right to participate in the debates and discussions upon the various subjects of administration." He provides an example of how the system used to operate to illustrate the reasons for its inclusion, stating, "Under the old Constitution, a Secretary of the Treasury, for instance, had no opportunity, save by his annual reports, of presenting any scheme or plan of finance or other matter. He had no opportunity of explaining, expounding, enforcing, or defending his views of policy. His only resort was through the medium of an organ." The purpose behind this change was to enable for cabinet members to better explain their policies to Congress, thus helping clear up any confusion over proposals made by the cabinet members for Congress. Fourth, he mentions a major change to presidential terms, stating, "Another change in the Constitution relates to the length of the tenure of the presidential office. In the new Constitution, it is 6 years instead of 4, and the president rendered ineligible for re-election. This is certainly a decidedly conservative change. It will remove from the incumbent all temptation to use his office or exert the powers confided to him for any objects of personal ambition. The only incentive to that high ambition which should move and actuate one holding such high trusts in his hands will be the good of the people, the advancement, prosperity, happiness, safety, honor, and true glory of the Confederacy." Fifth, and finally, he discusses a change, of sorts, to the Constitution, this being the most quoted section of this document. In his speech, he states, "But not to be tedious in enumerating the numerous changes for the better, allow me to allude to one other, though last, not least. The new Constitution has put at rest, forever, all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery as it exists among us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization." The language here takes a sudden shift from the previous examples. Where the others pertain to strictly legal statements, Stephens becomes more esoteric in his description. This is best summarized in the quote that gave this speech its rather erroneous name. Stephens states the following, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests, upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition." Much of what follows is considerably more esoteric in nature than the prior sections. He discusses the notion of the inferiority of the black race towards the white as a general principle, a rule of nature, as it were. It isn't marked with any of the legalistic reasoning of the prior sections, but it comes off more as a general statement of condition. My reasoning for pointing this out is because Stephens himself had to address this matter. In a letter written in 1865 titled, "What I Really Said in the Savannah Speech," he addresses a common misconception derived from this particular section. He opened by stating, "As for my Savannah speech, about which so much has been said, and in regard to which I am represented as setting forth slavery as the cornerstone of the Confederacy, it is proper for me to state that that speech was extemporaneous. The reporter's notes, which were very imperfect, were hastily corrected by me, and were published without further revision and with several glaring errors. The substance of what I said on slavery was, that on the points under the old Constitution, out of which so much discussion, agitation, and strife between the states had arisen, no future contention could arise, as these have been put to rest by clear language. I did not say, nor do I think the reporter represented me as saying, that there was the slightest change in the new Constitution from the old regarding the status of the African race amongst us. This statement is further affirmed by the Confederate Constitution. It does not mention any status change between blacks and whites, but what it does lay out is the protections of the institution through a prohibition on the Confederate government from abolishing it and addressing the issues mentioned in the secession documents concerning it. Even the language used in this speech is very much designed to be crowd-pleasing language for the time, further proving Stephens's later remarks. Beyond this point, Stephens discusses the role of the Confederacy, namely that the South has a viable chance of becoming an independent nation. He mentions its landmass, wealth, and resources, harkening back to the American War for Independence to indicate the possibility of success. Yet he also makes a note of the current times in offering a statement that, rather ironically, contradicts Atun-Shei's appeal to war being an inevitability, stating, "As to whether we shall have war with our late Confederates, or whether all matters of differences between us shall be amicably settled, I can only say that the prospect of a peaceful adjustment is better, so far as I'm informed, than it has been. The prospect of war is, at least, not so threatening as it has been. The idea of coercion, shadowed forth in President Lincoln's inaugural, seems to not be followed up thus far so vigorously as was expected. Fort Sumter, it is believed, will soon be evacuated. What course will be pursued towards Fort Pickens and the other forts on the Gulf is not so well understood. It is to be greatly desired that all of them should be surrendered. Our object is peace, not only with the North, but with the world. All matters relating to the public property, public liabilities of the Union when we were members of it, we are ready and willing to adjust and settle upon the principles of right, equity, and good faith." Beyond this, he actually made a number of other remarks. For instance, he discussed other improvements to the Confederate Constitution, including a provision that prevented Congress from appropriating funds from the Treasury except through a 2/3 majority vote. He also further discussed extending ahead to Europe and the rest of the world, allegedly stating that, instead of an olive branch, it would be a cotton plant to symbolize the South's cooperation with the rest of the world. However, this section is where the reporter's flaws come into full effect. He merely mentions these discussions, but has no transcript of them. Only one other section is recorded in great detail, which is often tacked on to the end of most online publications of the speech. To summarize, the Savannah speech, or the Cornerstone speech, is a long-winded speech that, in some instances, we don't know the full details of. He does make mention of slavery being the proximate cause of the conflict within the speech, and, in many instances, his speech indicates a consistency between his pre-war and post-war views. Most important of all, the speech is more complex than what most people give it credit for being. It is not merely the one-off quotations given by most internet memes, but a long, ponderous speech with considerable details on matters wholly unrelated to slavery. Just as with the causes of secession and the Secession Convention proceedings, there's a lot more going on than just a singular issue. To this end, we can now look into Atun-Shei's presentation of the speech. The first quotation Atun-Shei uses is another example of quote doctoring. The first part of the line is stated near the beginning of his speech, but is interrupted by the crowd outside the Athenaeum demanding he go outside and speak. This interruption lasts for a while before he continues. However, the second part of this quotation isn't even mentioned until much later on in the speech, after enumerating on the changes to the Confederate Constitution. With the second part of this quotation, the full line is read as follows. "Our system commits no such violation of nature's laws. with us the white race, however high or low, rich or poor, are equal in the eyes of the law. Not so the Negro. Subordination is his place. Excluding the erroneous nature of his quotations, it's important to consider here that what Stephen said wasn't even radical for the time. As Mr. Crow's symphonic slander has demonstrated, everyone shared this view, including Northerners. It was only the most radical people who rejected this view and adopted the notion of absolute equality. The claim that the Confederacy was founded on white supremacy is, in all sense of the word, meaningless as an accusation. After all, if everyone is a white supremacist, then no one is. Even the quotation from Jefferson Davis, if we presume that they were correct and not at all doctored as with half of the quotations in this work, weren't radical either. Most everyone believed that the black population had been improved upon entering the West and being brought up under the Protestant Anglo-Saxon ideals of the nation. None of this is radical, it was purely a common view of that time. And so, I will address this final quotation from Atun-Shei. Just as with most of the other quotes he has used, it has been heavily altered, leaving out bits of details that might add some further context to the original remarks. The section, which is alluding to the beliefs of Thomas Jefferson, is as follows. The prevailing ideas entertained by him, and most of the leading statesmen at the time of the formation of the old Constitution, were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. It was an evil they knew not well how to deal with, but the general opinion of the men of that clay was that, somehow or other, in the order of Providence, the institution would be evanescent and pass away. This idea, though not incorporated in the Constitution, was the prevailing idea at that time. The Constitution, it is true, secured every essential guarantee to the institution while it should last, and hence no argument can be justly urged against the constitutional guarantees thus secured, because of the common sentiment of the day. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of the races. This was an error. It was a sandy foundation, and the government built upon it fell when the storm came and the winds blew. This particular statement is what lends credence to Stephens' 1865 letter. This is not commenting on the Constitution itself, but on the social situation of the time, the belief that slavery would eventually die out. Stephens believed that this presumption had been incorrect, which is what prompted his most oft-quoted line from the speech. Even so, this view is specifically that of Stephens himself. It didn't embody the beliefs of other Southerners, such as Robert E. Lee. Lee, in the same letter condemning the institution as a moral evil, had expressed the same view that Stephens had rejected as a wrong viewpoint. He believed slavery would come to an end in the order of Providence, as Stephens termed it. This leads me back to the statement I've made numerous times throughout this series. Everyone has an opinion. I made that point clear as early as episode 2 of this very series. People will always have different ways of viewing the world, which is why you cannot assert one person's opinion as embodying the whole. The constant reliance on opinions is the most tiresome argument of them all. But folks, we're nearly done with this travesty. Atun-Shei posits one final thing.
Look, man, I'm running out of ways to say it here. The Civil War was caused by slavery. It was. Are you finally ready to accept that truth?
After looking through everything you have presented, I wouldn't call a single thing you have said here a truth. But, for the sake of the question itself, I will posit the question here. Was the American Civil War caused by slavery? My answer to this question is with another, more profound question. Why couldn't there be more than one cause for the war? When has the world ever been as simple as to have only one cause? After studying through all of these secession documents, after spending nearly 2 years researching this topic specifically to respond to these videos, after sacrificing countless evenings reading about the conflict and the men who fought in it, I just find it foolish to suggest that there could only be one cause. Slavery, states' rights, tariffs, demographics, ideology. All of these things have to be understood in order to understand why the war took place. I ask a follow-up question to this. Why does the cause of the war matter? I see the entire affair as a tragedy. We can pontificate endlessly about causes, but the abject misery, the suffering, pain, and death so many were subjected to cannot be denied. To this end, my full answer to the question, was the American Civil War caused by slavery, is simply this. I cannot say for certain, but I know for certain that the war was a tragedy. Can we all agree on this? To answer that final question, I doubt Atun-Shei would agree. After this final bit, it enters into a 40-minute long skit, just to follow up to his previous insult that he framed as entertainment. It is nothing more than a sad attempt at comedy, forced movie references, and action that is in line with the amateurish nature of his content. The audacity for him to claim his series is meant to be entertainment when he can't even be entertaining stings harder than a swarm of yellow jackets attacking a man mowing his lawn. In conclusion, this episode, something that is supposed to be an epic finale of a series, is fitting for the overall quality of the historiography of the series. Poor in quality, if not deliberately insulting to one's intelligence. The amount of altered, if not completely doctored, quotations is deeply insulting to his viewer base. Coupled with the fact that he uses citations from books rather than referring directly to the original documents, all of which are available online for free, it creates a deliberate barrier between his audience and the source material, thus making it difficult to criticize his presentation. In addition, Atun-Shei has demonstrated his ability to exert considerable power and influence over other content creators, such as him messaging Vlogging Through History, asking for him to not review the video, to which he obliged, as well as indoctrinating an entire generation of teenagers and young adults into believing everything he says is absolute fact and not at all disputed, even though the very sources he uses openly contradict his assertions. Couple that with a thoroughly unfunny, predictable skit that takes up 2/3 of the video, all in a vain attempt to dissuade people from criticizing the sloppy citation work by masquerading as entertainment. And you have the recipe for a video that every single Union Dixie listening teenage boy will link to every single Civil War talk thread, claiming that the people who've spent decades researching the conflict in meticulous detail are, in fact, wrong. This is truly a good example of why people should not be getting their history from college film students and should, instead, take the time to do the research themselves, carefully read through the material from a wide range of historians, and come to their own conclusions. With all of that said, I would like to thank everyone who's made it through this long video. I pray for the best for everyone who has watched this, both those who agreed or disagreed. I pray that those souls mentioned in this video, including Atun-Shei, will adopt the virtues of patience, wisdom, and faith. And finally, may God bless all of you. Wait, why has the video ended yet?
Your suffering is nearly over.
I thought this was the end. I thought this would be over with.
Your suffering is nearly over, but we cannot be there for you.
Why not?
I cannot explain why. Well, gee, which is all figments of your imagination, but I digress!
What must I do?
You must cover the finer bits of Checkmate Lincolnites and bring the evil to an end.
Oh, okay. So that's it? That's it?
Yeah, that's really it. Do you have anything else to say, Mr. Cow?
I don't have really anything else to say. Just get done with this.
Okay. Change the world! My final message! Goodbye!
Oh, is that really... Ah!